morning. It's November the 12th, Veterans Day, and we are at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And we're doing an oral history interview with Mr. Russ Wollen. Ross, welcome.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for agreeing to do an interview that we will make available eventually to the public. And for the record, I'm Karl Weissenbach, the Deputy Director and Supervisory Archivist at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. And I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank West Point for making this possible. And we will also make the videotape available to West Point, which will be part of their archival collection. Ross, will you give us a brief background about your career, including West Point?
Okay, yes. Born in New Jersey, May of 1943. Union City area, moved to Fort Lee, New Jersey, I guess just before high school. I attended Xavier High School in New York City, which was then 100% military and still is what we call a feeder school to West Point. We have two young cadets just joined in the new class of 2011. We have 2 or 3 each year. There were 4 graduates from my class from Xavier who went to West Point. And I keep that affiliation. I'm very pleased with that and do my recruiting from Xavier. Mm-hmm. Mostly because of the military at Xavier, I decided to apply for West Point. And I joined the class of 1965 and played tennis and squash while here, which I've often said made it possible for me to graduate because it really gives you something to do on weekends and an opportunity back in those days. As us old grads say, it was much rougher then. But then again, every old grad says that about a previous class. I graduated in '65. I was actually in the Air Defense, which brought me to El Paso, Texas, several trips. My first assignment was a tough one in Miami, Florida, in an air defense unit that had been moved there as a result of the Bay of Pigs crisis, and the Cuban Missile Crisis first, and then before that the Bay of Pigs, which I should know. Served in Germany with a Special Ammunition Support Command, where the Americans would, I don't think this is classified any longer, but the Americans would protect the nuclear weapons and turn them over to the German Air Force for air defense purposes. Mm-hmm. This was during the Cold War. That would be in 66, 67. In 68, 9, I went to Vietnam and served a year in Vietnam. There was no need for air defense at the time, so we were made to be artillery officers, so I served in a 105 howitzer battery. I was actually the headquarters commander for about 9 months or so. I left the service after that. That was I spent 1 more year. Even though I had already volunteered and went to Vietnam early, I was retained at the pleasure of the president, as all my classmates were. So I spent an extra year protecting El Paso, Texas, from air defense problems. I then attended Virginia Law School.
At the University of Virginia?
Well, yes, I should modify that. I was not able to get into Virginia, where my brother had gone, because my grades were not very good here at West Point. I was not a science major. And I actually went to Charlottesville the day that the class was entering and was told by the Dean of Admissions that I didn't make it, that about 6 new people came in with straight 800s or 900s or whatever it takes. And so I went to another very good school in Atlanta, Georgia, Emory.
Yes.
And I told the dean, I'm going to finish first in my class and get all the awards, and then I'm going to transfer back. He said, you do it, and you will. So I did, and so I transferred back to Virginia for my second and third years of law school. Competed for and became managing editor of the Law Review, and graduated from Virginia Law.
Now, what year was that? Did you graduate?
1973.
1973. Okay.
Married a lady from the class of 74. It's quite a class. I have classmates who's the head of the FBI, and Chuck Robb, who was the senator from Virginia, and the dean of the law school is also my classmate.
Mm-hmm.
Just like my class of 65 from West Point has got some luminaries, which we'll get to, I guess, later. Practiced in New York City for a number of years, actually joined what was not then called, but was previously called Nixon, Mudge, Rose, Alexander for several years.
I think I've heard of that law firm
Oh, yes.
before.
They've changed their name, obviously. When I was there, Mr. Mitchell had just returned from the White House, and Nixon was still president, and so his name had been taken off. But it was principally a municipal bond law firm, what they were best known for.
Did you ever have any conversations with Mitchell about
Mitchell,
the Nixon years?
No, you never discussed that. No, not at that time. No, Mitchell actually interviewed me because they really wanted to hire me, so they put on what Nixon would call a full court press, and Mitchell, who had never interviewed before, I'll never forget it. It's interesting because they're supposed to fill out a form, and he's filling out the form, which says personal stuff about, this guy's bright, or this guy's dumb, or something. And then he says, I guess I give this to you. And I said, I don't think you're supposed to, Mr. Mitchell. I think you give it to somebody else. But I joined them, spent several years there. While I enjoyed it, I knew I would feel more comfortable in a corporate setting, which is something I'd always had in mind. And one of our major clients was General Cigar Company, and I got to know the chairman very well. And he invited me to form a legal department at General Cigar, which they had never had before. So I did that, and that lasted something like 25 years.
Oh, really?
And but it's more than just a cigar company. We had dozens and dozens of different companies over the years, and my specialty was mergers and acquisitions and securities work, and so I was very active in buying and selling companies for quite a number of years.
I know that you have a cigar.
Yes, well,
Want to make sure everybody knows that I have a cigar.
Not the subject of this interview, but this is a Cohiba cigar, which I spent the last 5 years of my, I'm retired now, we didn't get to that, but my professional life protecting the Cohiba. It's a fascinating story, because we came out with the Cohiba brand in the 70s, and then Mr. Castro and his Cuban Havana people came out with the Cohiba, which they had given away privately to Khrushchev and things like that. It was a diplomatic gift. It was never sold. And it resulted in a lawsuit by the Cuban government against my General Cigar Company in 1996, and fascinating legal issues, and a lot of people are surprised that even with the embargo, that the Cuban government can sue an American company, which they can. And so I spent a great deal of time, all the history of it, resulted in a fascinating trip to Havana, Cuba, where we were the guest of Mr. Castro and his government, and in trying to negotiate a settlement, which we never could. The case was in the Southern District of New York, and we lost at the lower level, and we won at the appellate level. The
Good.
appellate court reversed Judge Sweet's decision, which was very interesting, and I spent a great deal of time on that, testifying and preparing, attending depositions, and it's a fascinating case. And at the moment, you can buy a Cohiba with this red dot. It sounds like a commercial now, anywhere in the United States and outside. But if you see a Cohiba in Europe, it's probably Cuban.
Oh, right, okay. Now, where do you live?
I live on Roosevelt Island.
Roosevelt Island, okay.
It's a fascinating place. It's the one with the tram. It's right in the East River. The tram goes from Roosevelt Island to Bloomingdale's. And I've lived there. Actually, I missed yesterday's 30th anniversary party.
Oh, did you?
Yes. But it's a fascinating place. It's going through tremendous reconstruction now, new co-ops, new condominiums, and we were some of the first pilgrims, if you will, back in the late 70s when it was first constructed.
Very interesting. When you were at West Point, I think you were the features editor, is that right?
The Point of View was the student magazine. I'd actually done the same thing at Xavier. I was the head editor of that, and then of course I became editor at law school. So I've been an editor of all of them. Yes, I think I wasn't the editor in chief. I was the features editor.
Features editor, yeah. I know we want to talk about the interesting interview you did with Eisenhower, but I imagine that you also did interviews with other notables at the time.
It was all part of one feature, if you will. And in fact, I think we called it Class of 15 Featured. We were the Class of 65. The Class of 15 is very well known as the class the stars fell on, because in addition to Ike and Bradley, each with 5 stars, they had a handful of 4 stars and lots of 3s and 2s and 1s. And it occurred to me, I don't know how it started, but I think it was just my idea, to interview as many of them as I could during my senior year. And I started, interestingly, I somehow learned that Gene Leone, who was the restaurateur, he was the son of the famous Mama Leone's restaurant in New York, which was very closely associated with West Point and, in fact, the Class of 15. And he had been made an honorary member of the Class of 15. And there's some great stories about Ike and people like that. No cadet would ever wait in line at Mama Leone's. They'd be brought right to the front. And usually, if they paid anything, it was a lot less than others would pay. And somehow I connected with him first, and it was great because he lived here near West Point. And I went out to his farm, and he was very, very gracious and spent a good deal of time with me and had a lot of inside stories on the Class of 15. And that helped me when I interviewed them subsequently, because I'd say, Gene Leone told me, and they say, wow, we promised we'd never talk about that, that type of thing. So I think I started with Leone, but from him I learned that a lot of the class were coming back for a mini reunion. Their real reunion was going to be in the spring, close to my graduation. The mini reunion was in the fall, I think probably a football game, and they all stayed very close to where we are today in Cullum Hall at that time. And so I went over, and I was the only cadet, and I'm with all of these, a good 20 of the Class of 15.
Which included Eisenhower?
No, not at that time.
Not at that time, okay.
None of these 4 or 5 star guys were there at that time. And which was kind of fun also, because I got to talk to all of them, listen to their stories, and I wrote one article that just based on them. And the thing I recall, and I put it in the article, was that very early on, one of the generals said, "You know, this kid," and I was 20 years old, "he looks at us the way we look at those Civil War guys." And it's the mathematics works. 65 talking to 15, and when they were cadets at 15, the class of 1860 had fought the Civil War and had come back to West Point. Those who were still alive, anyway.
Very interesting.
It is. And to just put a cap on it, when I was interviewed recently in the Assembly magazine on this subject, the cadet who did that was the class of '05. So you go from 65 to 15 to 65 to '05. Following up that, I knew I had invited or asked to interview all of the top generals: Eisenhower, Bradley, McNarney, Van Fleet, and a couple others that I'll think of. And they would dribble in and they'd say, "I'll be up at West Point for this football game," in which case I would do it. And the two big ones, of course, were Bradley and Eisenhower. And I did Bradley in New York City at the Astor Hotel, where he lived, or at least spent. He was, I think, the chairman of Boulevard Watch at the time. Had a penthouse with 5 stars on it, and I spent a morning with him, interviewing him. And it was about a month later that I interviewed General Eisenhower in Gettysburg.
Yeah, let me stop you there for a second. Let's go back to Bradley interview. How did you prepare for that? Did you decide that you wanted to interview Bradley and then Eisenhower to help you prep for the Eisenhower interview? Or what was did you have a timeline or a systematic approach?
It was just a matter of when I could see them. Because in addition to their schedules, I'm hardly, I can't demand them. I'm not 60 minutes. I can't say be somewhere. Right. I think Ike actually invited me to Palm Desert at one time and said he'll send an Army plane for me. And I said, "Gee, that's nice for a cadet sergeant." But and I also had I was very active playing squash during the winter, tennis during the spring, and so I had to meet it with my schedule as well. So the Bradley was easy because I'd be visiting my parents, and it'd just be a matter of going over into New York City. So that happened first. The Eisenhower, we traded lots of dates, and nothing seemed to work until he was going to be in Gettysburg the day before the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. So that was a natural. And my father actually drove me to Gettysburg, and that was the day before the Army-Navy game.
When you prepared for the Eisenhower interview, did you follow the same script as when you interviewed General Bradley?
In both cases, I did some decent research. I read some books. I even had I think I had a plebe or a yearling researcher who worked for the Point of View. So I said, and wanted to be a feature editor or something like that. So I said, "I'm interviewing Bradley, do some research, give me the best questions you can get." And so yes, I had a pretty good outline that I would take in both interviews.
Being a cadet, right, and knowing that you were going to interview General Eisenhower, who had been a 2-term president of the United States, were you a little bit intimidated? Were you worried about the type of questions you could ask? Were there questions that you decided you shouldn't ask?
Not really. In fact, I think it's just the opposite. Okay. I think I was young and naive, and I think I would ask questions that that a Walter Cronkite wouldn't dare.
Well, yeah, I want to get into that. Did the Academy require you to present questions for review, or did you have carte blanche to ask whatever you thought was appropriate?
was totally on my own
Mm-hmm.
until my interview with Bradley made all the newspapers
Right.
in the world.
Now I want you to talk about that because I think there was a New York Times article about your interview. Do you want to?
There was a yes. The what got everybody's attention. There's a lot of very interesting things in the Bradley article, which is only a couple of pages.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you sit and interview someone, and I think in Bradley's case it was about 2.5 hours, because his wife came in, she brought in fresh danishes and coffee about 4 times, and somehow you have to distill that down to 2 pages in the point of view, which is what I did. Until that time, nobody gave me any advice. Nobody looked at anything, and I don't think it was edited, other than by maybe my roommate, edited for publication. What changed all of that dramatically was the fact that I did ask General Bradley about the Falaise Gap. Yes. And in the course of his answer, he said that Monty, Viscount Montgomery, was so darn scared. That went out something, I think, in November. I heard not a word about it. I've often joked that I think the head of the history department, who was my classmate, Colonel Bob Doty, said he read it, and he's the only person I know who read it, until the Associated Press picked it up in late December. And I was home for Christmas, and my father called upstairs and said, "Russ, you better take a look at the New York Times." And there was an article about reopening the wounds of World War II. Bradley calls Montgomery so darn scared, the reference being that we were trying to close the gap, the Falaise Gap, and the Americans, or at least Bradley thought, were moving well enough, but Montgomery was waiting for the better weather and better air support. And Eisenhower was quoted as saying the result was that instead of putting the cap on the toothpaste, you squeezed it out. And several divisions, corps of German troops escaped, where they could have been captured and might have ended the war, might have avoided the subsequent Battle of the Bulge. I mean, there are a lot of theories out there. That's my own. But it made very, very big headlines in the south of the United States, and of course in Britain. In Britain, it was in every front page. Now, the result of that is that my subsequent interviews were heavily reviewed, edited. Actually, I knew I couldn't put anything the slightest bit feisty in there, so I edited them myself. As a result, the Eisenhower interview, which I had already finished in late November, which had a lot of very, very interesting things in it,
Right.
never got published.
But getting back to the Bradley interview, it seems like to me that, yes, it just might have been perceived as controversial, but there wasn't anything really negative, if you will. I mean, it might have been negative to Montgomery, right? What was the concern of your peers and superiors that you had damaged or inadvertently damaged the reputation?
Well, I assume nobody. I got phone calls from generals at West Point, from generals at Washington and in Washington, and cadet sergeants don't usually have 3-star generals calling them and saying we're concerned about the article you wrote and the next one you're going to write, because at the end of my Bradley article, I said next month we will have his classmate, Dwight D. Eisenhower. So everybody knew there was another one coming, and what is Ike going to say? But I have to think they were concerned. I mean, England is our ally. Ike and Bradley were both. They tried very hard to be diplomatic, even in their latest. You read the new Corda book, which just came out recently on Eisenhower. Ike. He spends chapters and chapters on the relationship between Montgomery and Bradley and Ike and Patton, of course, which is a whole different story. So it's an issue, and certainly my understanding is the British newspapers took it as a low blow. And
They probably did, but I guess, this is like 20 years after the war, and it was still fresh.
Oh yeah, that's.
I think if Bradley made that kind of remark today, if he was still living, I don't think it would probably have the impact like it did then. Would you agree with that?
If Bradley made it, I think it still would.
You think it still would?
I think it still would. I mean, it's look, as I just said, the new book on Ike spends chapters on it, so obviously people are still interested in it. It was viewed as reopening an old wound, and certainly, as I said, got a lot of press. It was Newsweek, Time, everybody covered it. But one of them, Time, I think, had nothing uncertain about this trumpet that Bradley calls Montgomery so darn scared. So, I mean, I think if one of them said it directly rather than what's pretty interesting is that the article I did on Bradley, and it was just a clerical error, did not have my name on it. So nobody ever challenged me from the press. If my name had been there, I'm sure I would have gotten lots of calls. Obviously, the Pentagon knew it was me.
Right. Did Bradley have any post-interview reaction? Did you hear from him?
The only time, my graduation, several days before I graduated in June of 1965, I was invited to their reunion, the class of 15's reunion, at Gene Leone's farm. And my father had bound volumes of the interviews made, and I was going to give them to everybody. And I was the only cadet permitted out there. And I went up to Mr. Leone, and he said, "Hey, Cadet Wollen, how are you doing?" I said, "Fine." I said, "I'd like to, give these to the generals." And he said, "Fine, come on, I'll walk you around." So we walked around, and I gave copies like to Van Fleet and to McNarney, and there, off in the corner, was Ike and Bradley talking by themselves. Now, I'm not going to interrupt that conversation, but Gene Leone said, come on, and he walked me up, and he said, "Generals, you remember Cadet Wollen, don't you?" And they both looked at me, and yeah. And I said, "I'll give these to your aides, but I just would like you to know that I have a bound volume of the interviews that I did with each of you." And Bradley said, and I think I have this word for word, or at least I've written it before, so I can double check it. But he said, "Well, I'm not remembering exactly, other than," he said, "well, it was all fine, and I meant what I said, but we almost killed Montgomery." Montgomery had had a heart attack just several weeks, maybe a month prior, and so that was his comment. But it was obviously very well known to him what he had said. He got huge press inquiries, and he never followed up. He never, to my knowledge, he never spoke to anybody. So it died after a couple of weeks.
But he never denied making a comment.
Oh no, he couldn't. No.
Right.
He wouldn't to a West Point cadet covered by the honor code.
Right.
No, he said it.
Well, let's shift over to the interview with General Eisenhower. Did you have any correspondence between you and the general regarding what subjects should be brought up or should not be brought up, or
None whatsoever. He was disappointed that he thought we'd be talking more about football, perhaps because the Army Navy game was the next day. But I had my outline, and I'd done a lot of homework for that, a lot of research, and I had a lot of questions about. I mean, this was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy was president, and he had just been at Camp David with President Kennedy, and there was a famous picture of the two of them walking outside, and so I had all of these basic questions about World War II, his career, and politics and presidency, and toward the end, he literally said, I was hoping this was going to be more fun.
Yeah, and looking at the outline of the interview, you talk about the purpose of interview, early career, General MacArthur's recommendation, principles of war, and so forth. So it looks like overall the bulk of the interview centered on General Eisenhower's military career.
I'd say the bulk, also the presidency.
Right.
As
Yeah.
well.
You have you get the Kennedy picture, the presidential incapacity, which I think is a pretty interesting topic as well. When you met with General Eisenhower, it was at the Gettysburg farm.
No, it was at the campus,
The
Gettysburg University.
Okay. Were you two the only ones in the
We,
in the room?
I had a classmate, and if he sees this, call me, who was photographed for us, but he left, and I think he spent the time. My father drove us there from Philadelphia, and he took a few pictures and then left, and I was with Ike. It was just the two of us for a good hour and a half or so. It's not a very big office either.
Now, the interview was tape recorded.
Yes.
Okay, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that because I think, well, actually, we can talk a little bit about it now. But before I do, you received a letter from Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who reviewed the transcript, and apparently he made some changes. No.
He
He's corrected by there's a statement that says corrected by DDE and sent to West Point. Do you want to?
It was really nothing. This is what I was referring to as the absolute sanitized nothing interview. In fact, what I ended up doing, the Eisenhower one was, there was nothing I could put in there that would not be thrown out after. This is after the publicity. This is when I'd been called to task for the Bradley article. So I sanitized the Eisenhower so much so that I think I ended up with a question and having them answered by Bradley and Eisenhower, even though they answered them at different times because I asked them the same questions. I think you mentioned principles of war, so I'd have both of them respond to a question like that, which in my view is extremely sanitized, fluffy information. It's not Montgomery was so darn scared, and it's not what Ike told me and to answer many of my other questions. So to answer your question, the sanitized version was actually sent to Eisenhower as required by the Pentagon, and then he sent it back with a couple of very minor changes, and they're absolutely superfluous, meaningless. So no, he did not. The written article on Eisenhower, I don't think you'll find anything in there of any excitement whatsoever.
The one thing about Eisenhower is that during his post-presidential years, he seemed to be more forthcoming on a variety of subjects. He had a book called At Ease. I'm not sure if you had a chance to read it.
I read that prior to the interview.
Which I think is pretty enlightening. But when you also go through...
It's At Ease, Stories I Tell My Friends.
Exactly. And when you go through his post-presidential papers at the Eisenhower Library, you notice that, he has some pretty strong opinions about, you know, various subjects. For example, Vietnam. He had conversations with Johnson. And he talks, you know, he talks about the Vietnam War. He talks about politics, Goldwater. He talks about, you know, Kennedy. He was sort of like the elder statesman of the country, if you will. And
Right.
I think he was more at liberty to talk about, you know, various issues, get some things off his chest, and so forth. In the interview that you had with him, did you get a sense that he was at ease, that he was anxious to talk about his military career, presidential terms, two presidential terms, and family and whatnot? What kind of sense did you get from what he was trying to accomplish in that interview?
I think he was tolerant of my questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a first class West Point cadet, sitting in front of the fellow has 3 flags on his desk: President of the United States, the head of SHAEF, and the head of NATO. That's a little intimidating.
So you were a little bit intimidated in the interview.
Well, that's intimidating. But by the same token, we've kind of lost the track. But I carried a 40-pound tape recorder up there. He plugged it in, and I hid. Hid's not the right word, but I didn't want to put it right in front of his nose. But I put it behind the flags. And in a subsequent letter, he said, because I had forgotten that you had a tape recorder, I was more candid than I would like to have been. So that may get to your answer.
Yeah.
That he was talking to a cadet. He was enjoying that, I think. He was certainly in no rush whatsoever. I could have stayed longer, although he got a call from Mamie about lunch toward the end. I think he was enjoying it, yes. And I think I asked some pretty good questions,
I
quite
think you
frankly.
did too.
Now, you mentioned one. I have no recollection about politics or Goldwater. He very clearly told me that we should never get involved in a land war in the Far East, which would be Vietnam. This is 1964, when we already were somewhat, but that was his very firm. The most emotional he was, I'll mention this because we might not come back to it, is when he talked about he considered himself a Jeffersonian Republican. And he actually looked out the window and he teared up. He said, when you take the power from these people out here, and then he didn't finish the sentence.
He choked up.
He choked up. And then he kind of came back and said, that's why I consider myself a Jeffersonian Republican. And I don't think I pursued that. I wasn't ready for that.
Well, you mentioned the Vietnam War. We should not be involved in, I think you said land invasion?
Land war.
Land war.
In I think he said the Far East. I may have notes. I have a few notes that I've not given to anybody, and I may have that. But it was very clearly he was referring to Vietnam.
Did you get a sense that he felt that we should not get further involved in that conflict?
Yes, that certainly was my impression. I mean, this is 64. I mean, we were there, but we weren't there in a big way like we were to be in subsequent years. I think it was the military expert in him just saying that that's a war that we shouldn't fight, a land war in Asia.
Did he comment about the incumbent president? And
I asked about. Well, first, as a predicate, may I say, the tape has been destroyed.
Right. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yeah.
So we're going on 40 years of memory.
Right.
And I want to be careful because, as Ike asked me, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, but he wanted portions of the tape erased, and I consider other portions, somewhat confidential. That given the fact that he, immediately said, "I forgot you had a tape recorder and don't want a public record of certain things." He didn't say the whole thing, but he certainly was. He was. So I think my answer to your earlier question is, I think he was talking to me somewhat confidentially, as a fellow West Pointer, despite the age difference and everything else. And in that respect, I do respect his subsequent admonition not to publicize certain things.
Well, we can talk about that a little bit here. There's November 27th, 1964, letter that General Eisenhower sent you, and quoting from the letter, it's a personal note, which he says, there's an item in your interview that concerns me and which impels me to ask you to do me a favor. He goes on to say that he had forgotten that you had a tape recorder with you during the interview, and consequently thought the interview was informal on a quote-unquote on a fairly confidential basis.
I'd forgotten he said that.
Yeah.
Yes.
But he plugged in a tape recorder for you.
And incidentally, that tape recorder was about 40 pounds.
40 pounds. And then
this is not a tiny little thing that you have nowadays.
Yeah. And then he says, then he adds, consequently, I request that you carefully eliminate from the record all portions of the tape that have to do with anything I said that could be critical in any way. So
well, no, that's critical about.
I mean, that's what he's saying, and I'm quoting.
Is there not a reference to his predecessor? There must be. Yes.
That's why he doesn't.
Really?
I don't see any.
Just read the sentence again. Critical.
Consequently, I request that you carefully eliminate from the record all portions of the tape that have to do with anything I said that could be critical in any way.
But doesn't that same letter, I'm quite certain, makes reference to his predecessor.
This is the information.
Really? If that's interesting. I've always read it as.
Well, I got the letter right here. You want to?
Okay. Yeah. Can I?
Sure. In the other line.
Well, yes. Look, the previous sentence. Thinking we were conversing informally and on a confidential basis, I made some remarks about my predecessor.
Oh, okay. All right.
That, while a truthful expression of my opinion, would be nothing but troublesome if ever found in the records.
Okay.
Therefore, consequently, I request that you carefully eliminate from the record all portions of the tape that have to do with anything I said that could be construed as critical in any way. So, I mean, he was clearly, and I think somewhat surprisingly to me, limiting it just to his predecessor, which obviously is President Truman. And that's how I've always read that, and in fact that's how he intended it, because since we've gone there, what happened is that there was about 6 minutes or so, and I deleted it from the tape, and I sent the full tape to his office. And I did not learn, I requested that after they do whatever they wanted to do with it, they return it to me. And I only learned from the Eisenhower Center 20, 30 years later that they listened to the tape, they made a transcript of the tape, not very good, and remember this is a 1960 tape recorder, which and was already. No, I guess the tape was fairly new at the time, but it was not. There was no engineer, and it was not professionally done in the slightest. So they had, I think, a couple of his secretaries did the best transcription of the tape that they could, and so that exists. But of course, I had already excised the 6 minutes about Truman.
Well, I know that's a real touchy subject, and I know you got to be careful in what you say because you don't want to divulge.
I've said in a previous, it's in the Assembly magazine. I said you can rest assured he was not very favorable about his predecessor, and that he said so in very clear and emphatic language.
Mm-hmm.
And I stick by that, of course.
Mm-hmm. Were these philosophical differences political or more of a personal?
They were personal. I've thought about this, and there's one example that I will give you. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to repeat. There in some of his discussions with me, he was fairly earthy, because he was talking, as he said in his letter. He thought he was being, it was confidential. He forgot there was a tape recorder, and I could curse pretty well. So I'm not going to go into that, but he did make one representation which I'm so clear about because I recall it, and since I think everybody's so many books have been written and the principles are gone, and it's not a very big thing, but Ike did say that Harry Truman doesn't have the sense of my two grandchildren, who at that time I think were not yet 10 years old or so. I haven't researched that, but I did make a note of that and have it. The others, they're kind of along the same line. I've not seen him, nor any biographer say that anywhere, but he said that to me, and that is the truth. But that's as far as I feel I should go right now. If I have a deathbed conversion, maybe I'll say something else.
Yeah, okay, I understand. But I think it's safe to say that Eisenhower didn't like Truman and vice versa. It wasn't just because Eisenhower refused to run as a Democrat. There were also major policy differences that perhaps originated during the Second World War. For example, the post-war occupation of Germany, the use of a nuclear bomb. I'm not sure those kind of things, came up, but we can talk about the open. I mean, what's actually in the interview, right? Did he refer to any differences he had with Truman that was part of the record?
Not that I can recall.
That you can recall, right?
Not that I can recall, and I think only 4 people listened to the tape before I cut out that part of it, and they're all deceased. My parents being 2.
Right.
Not that I can recall. Ike, earlier, this is tangential, but in my Bradley article, the final sentence in the Bradley article was I asked, did he know about the existence of the atomic bomb? And he said that Franklin Roosevelt told him and Eisenhower and Winston Churchill. And that so when he went back to Europe, Churchill, Ike, and Bradley were the only 3 people who knew about us possessing an atomic bomb. And he said in the interview with me, this is Bradley, I wish I didn't even know it, except that the warning was that we thought the Germans were getting close to creating one, and that we should put out warnings if any of our troops get sick from anything, a V-bomb or whatever. I do not recall any discussion with Eisenhower, although, I mean, I showed him the picture of he and Kennedy, and that was Cuban Missile Crisis, so certainly the subject, we had to discuss it. I think it was in my outline for me to ask. Now, in the outline is one thing, and as you know, whether you stick to it is something
Right.
else. And if you're sitting there with the former president of the United States, and he wants to talk about this, you're not going to say,
Right.
shut up, I want to get to my outline. And again, it's 40 years ago.
Right, right. But see, I find that very, fascinating. I mean, I know we can't talk about what was said. I mean, I know you have to protect, well, you made an agreement with General Eisenhower, and I understand the conditions that were imposed upon you and so forth. But I am fascinated by the Truman-Eisenhower relationship.
Sure.
It was, I think we can all agree that it was not a very positive one.
It's no secret. I mean,
There's
just
no
watch,
secret,
watch
right?
him going to the inauguration. They didn't even talk.
Well, actually, Truman invited Eisenhower to come to the White House, for coffee, and Eisenhower wouldn't do it. But I'm always trying to figure out why. Why would Eisenhower not even, if I can use this term, be civil about it? Right? What was there that made Eisenhower resent Truman the way he did? And I'm not quite clear on that. I mean, it's because they were, they both had radically different personalities.
I think what I heard was very personal, yes.
Yeah.
And also, look, Truman, now I'm just talking for myself
Right.
now, not necessarily anything that Eisenhower said to me, but Truman was a captain. He had fired MacArthur. Not that Ike and MacArthur were the best of buddies, but there was a lot of reason for conflict in that relationship. But anything else I were to say would be just what
I understand. Yeah.
what I've read, and not what I heard. Okay?
Right.
Let me put it that way.
Okay. Following the interview, did you have a different opinion of Eisenhower?
Oh, I was extremely impressed that he took the time and effort, and it was very nice. I've mentioned this before, that toward the end I said, my father's driven me here, and yeah, I always I have trouble with this, but you're one of his big heroes. So anyway, he came out and spent a good 20 minutes with my father.
Did he really? And what kind of conversation did they have?
Then he was back. He was happy. Eisenhower was happy because we were talking Army-Navy.
Army-Navy.
You're going to the game tomorrow, Mr.
Right.
Wollen? Yes, yeah. Well, I wish I could come, but if I go, it's a big mess, and then if I sit on the wrong side, and all that.
But when you walked into that interview, you probably had a perception of Eisenhower. And when you left that interview, did you have that same, did you think to yourself, wow, I had no idea, I didn't know he was going to be like this?
That's a good, fair question. Let me add, at the end of our interview, when I turned off the tape recorder he had forgotten was there, and moved it toward the door, he said, come in here, let me show you what I'm spending a lot of time on. And he opened this kind of a walk-in closet, which was not very large, and it was absolutely chock-a-block full of stuff. And he put on, there was one naked bulb, he pulled it and turned it on, and we spent the next 15 or 20 minutes in there. And it was all of his best of his stuff that had to be, he said, I've spent an hour or two a day on this stuff. I've got to send it to my library, the presidential library, send it to West Point, or give it to the family. And and of course I had no tape of this, it wasn't being taped, and my heart was throbbing. And he just went around picking things out. Oh, I haven't seen this, since World War II. Look at that. where do you think that should go? And he's asking me, you know. I said, well, the Presidential Library is not, because I'm a West Pointer, I'm there in my uniform. How about the West Point Museum? Well, okay, we'll think about that. It was thrilling.
So you found him to be a very personable individual.
Absolutely, and for him to spend it, he treated me like an equal, even though I was the lowest grade in the world, he was the highest. He was very, very nice, and quite frankly, I think he said, you know, I only see cadets when I go up to a parade or something like that. I don't, and maybe in Washington, I never, you know, I don't get to talk to him. I mean, that was the reason I think he was so forthcoming and so easy to speak with.
Were you more comfortable interviewing Eisenhower or Bradley?
I don't really recall a difference. Bradley, it was a little stilted simply because his wife kept coming in every 10 minutes with fresh coffee and fresh Danish and something else and kind of interrupting me. I have that distinct memory. But if you look at the pictures that I have from both of these, and they're smiling and they're very comfortable. They're obviously not in uniform, and no, I was awfully comfortable in both cases, and not interrupted. And I never felt hurried. I think except for Ike when he got the call from Mamie about lunch. And even then, he said, you know, that's all right. Later. The one acute story I may have mentioned to you that he had 3 phones behind him. One, it was a red phone with a picture of the White House on it. And he had earlier said that President Kennedy called him often. And I didn't say, you know, on that phone, but I'm sure it looked like it. And toward the end of the interview, the phone rings. And I literally threw my pen up in the air, and he looked at me with a big smile and put his hand over the White House and picked up the other. And, yeah, I'll be home for lunch. I'm just finishing with a cadet. So it was not the White House calling. But no, I was very comfortable in both cases, thrilled and comfortable.
It's been 43 years since you did an interview. My math is right.
Well, yep.
Looking back on the interview, would you do it differently? Would you ask? have you ever wondered whether you should have asked this question and not that question? And 'cause I know it had to be difficult because you were obviously a cadet at the time.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, though, are you comfortable with how you carried out the interview?
Yes, I think I am. I'm very pleased. I mean, if you want to be specific, should I have put in Montgomery was so darn scared? I'd say yes at that time. I mean, he told me it was the truth. I was naive. I had no idea that would cause a big blow up. He had also he said that Patton was my third. I had 3 Army commanders, and Simpson and Hodges were better than Patton. That never got much publicity because Patton was long gone, I guess. But there are a lot of spicy things in the Bradley article, and you could only imagine. Here's the regret, of course. If the Eisenhower article would have been fantastic, but I had just begun work on it when I got the Eisenhower letter. And then, subsequently, a couple of weeks later, then the Bradley blow-up. And then when I got back to West Point, then I started getting phone calls from generals who said, you're not doing an article on Eisenhower, are you? And I said, yes. He said, well, we'll want to look at it very carefully. Now, since I subsequently became a lawyer, I probably should have used the First Amendment a little bit there, but I was just a cadet just trying to graduate, so I didn't put up much of a fight.
Let me ask you this, Ross. If you were talking to an advanced history seminar class, right? you were talking about Eisenhower, right? Because you have something that I don't have, a lot of people don't have, right? You actually got to talk to the general, the two-term president, right? What would you want the students to know about Eisenhower that they may not know?
I like, particularly if I were talking to a West Point group, I would like to explore what he told me about being a Jeffersonian Republican, and that was his image of himself, of his politics, of his beliefs. And but I like I did before I interviewed the two generals, I would do a lot of homework before I spoke to a history class, and particularly an advanced history class, as much as I love history, and I support the history department here as often as I can. But I'm a great student of Mr. Jefferson, and to have Eisenhower say that and compare himself to Jefferson is means a lot to me, and I could see doing a seminar on that without question.
Did he talk a bit more about that instead of just making that statement?
Wow. What'd you say, 43 years?
43 years, I know. Yeah.
Yes, he did, but
It's been a while.
I've read every book on Ike and half of the books on Jefferson, and I could never be sure whether I'm quoting a book or quoting what he might have said to me at the time. That was, without question, his most emotional time. He really choked up. He looked out the window, and he there was a lot there. I mean, he was saying something about how the government is getting too large, and this fits with his industrial, complex, military-industrial complex speech. To give that when he departs is, I think that had that same flavor in there, but it was very personal because he looked out. He said, "When you take from these people the right to govern themselves," and then he never finished. But
Did he talk about his farewell speech in the interview?
I asked him. I'm pretty sure I asked him. I don't remember the.
Because there's been a lot of controversy about what he actually meant, and depending on what side of the aisle you're on, you're using that speech for whatever purpose, right? Did you get a sense as to, knowing what you know about Eisenhower now, right? What do you think he meant by
the presidential speech? Oh, wow. I'd have to think about it. I'd have to study it. We, an interesting aside, and it is an aside, but when I was a cadet here in my senior year, we had speeches from Douglas MacArthur, his famous Duty, Honor, Country speech, followed by John F. Kennedy speaking at graduation. And I've studied those two speeches together, and in many respects, it's do what I say, not what I do. I mean, MacArthur says stay out of politics, but of course that was not his ultimate goal. And Kennedy is saying you've got to be bright. You've got to question orders. It's fascinating to study those two speeches, and as fortunate as I was, and of course it's one of the highlights of my life to have interviewed Ike and Bradley, but to have also attended the MacArthur speech and the Kennedy speech, and they're all gone now, and two of them were gone very quickly. It's quite a thrill.
Did you have any post-interview contact with General Eisenhower?
Just graduation. Yeah, a little bit on we haven't discussed the telegram he sent to the Army-Navy game, but
yeah, it's I wasn't quite sure how long this tape
I think you're close to an hour now.
We're over an hour, so did he say it was an hour?
He said 58 minutes.
So I need to shut this off?
No, try it.
bit about a telegram from November 1964, and it pertains to the Army-Navy game. Do you want to talk a little bit about
Sure.
that, since you're familiar with it?
Well, I was interviewing General Eisenhower just a day before the Army-Navy game. That's the reason I was in Philadelphia. So it occurred to me to encourage him to send a telegram to the team. It was my classmates were the seniors leading the team. We had lost, I think, 6 years in a row. And so to beat Navy would be extremely important, to put it mildly, for us. And I had come across somewhere, and I don't recall where I saw it, but the saying that the more you give, the more you will keep. And I drafted a telegram for the general's signature. And it had the background of the history, because I researched the fact that his team had lost to Navy, I think, 3 of the previous 4 years. I'm refreshing my recollection, as they say, looking at this. 50 years ago this date, Army met Navy. We too had lost to them 5 out of 6 times.
Here's a annotated version too.
And his class of 1915 led the Army team to a 20-0 victory, and as he said, the pride to our class despite the varied paths down which this half-century has led us. I'm pretty sure I wrote that. I did make a change in what I offered him. Yes, the first 2 paragraphs are what I proposed. He left, "You will always have what you give today," and he added, "The more you give, the more you will keep," which I think is very, very nice, and particularly for someone to just sit down, and that is in his own handwriting. And then he added, "Every Army man is with you all the way." And he did, in fact, it was typed by his secretary while I was there, and then he subsequently sent it in a telegram to West Point, and West Point sent it to Paul Dietzel, who was the coach at the time. And only recently did I learn from the Eisenhower Center that Dietzel had read it to the team, and this was subsequently confirmed by a couple of my classmates who played in the game and did recall the coach reading the telegram the night before the game. And Dietzel said in a letter to Eisenhower, which I just read in the last couple of years and didn't know about until then, that it was one of the most inspirational telegrams, letters of any sort that he had ever received from an alumnus. And what makes a difference, no one knows, but the fact is we did beat Navy finally. Not only Navy, but that was Roger Staubach's senior year, and he had beaten us 3 years in a row. The previous year was the Heisman Trophy winner, and now, of course, NFL Hall of Fame, et cetera, et cetera. So it was quite a victory that we still celebrate, particularly the class of '65, who were the leaders of the team for that '64 game.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and my class, as part of a recent reunion gift to the Academy, we have refurbished the entranceway to the Cadet Gymnasium, which was already named for our classmate Bob Arvin. Bob was killed in Vietnam. The gymnasium is named after him. Incidentally, I visited his grave yesterday on Veterans Day. There are about 16 of our classmates there, and too many new people there too. So as part of our refurbishment of the gymnasium, we had put a copy of the telegram in brass up on the wall, together with Bob Arvin's Silver Stars and a list of our classmates who were killed in the service. So the telegram means a lot to me, and I'm very pleased to have gotten it. And slowly, the bottom line, you'll always have what you give today. The more you give, the more you'll keep, is slowly making its way into more and more academy lore, Lore, up there with "there is no substitute for victory" and some of the other great sayings of coaches. So, and I did subsequently send a couple of things to me about that the telegram was delivered, and et cetera, et cetera. The only other conversation I had with him was when he came to his reunion in my graduation in the spring of '65.
West Point means a lot to you. I've noticed that.
Yes, well, it's
as
part
it
of it's
should.
living. Well, part of it's living as close as I do. It certainly makes it easy, and I do come up to the football games, and I've been very involved as a class officer, and I'm now on the board of advisors. Yes, it means a lot, but so does my high school, and so does some of the other things. I'm retired. I have time to do things like that now, and it's a beautiful place, and no better cause.
And you've also been into the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, I think, what, on 2 or 3 occasions?
No, that was my first
That was
visit.
your first visit?
Abilene is not an easy place to get to.
No, it's not. Yeah.
I've been to the MacArthur, which is quite interesting, which looks like a presidential library that he wanted. He's quite a character. I attended, in addition to the speech, the whole Corps of Cadets went to New York City for MacArthur's, when they moved his casket from, it was in the church next to the Waldorf, down, I think, to Penn Station. And it was a cold, rainy day, and the city was absolutely quiet. And it was one of the most touching things I'll ever remember. And they had a 21-gun salute in New York City, and it would echo, echo, echo. Just, I think most of my classmates remember that, more vividly than going to a presidential inauguration parade or something like that.
Looking back at your career, what would you say were the main highlights? Excluding family, because I think family always comes first.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's the birth of your child, it has to be first. But sitting here at West Point, I would have to say, and after this discussion, certainly spending 20 minutes in a small closet with Dwight D. Eisenhower, discussing his favorite things, many of which he said, nobody's seen these before. For a 20-year-old kid, that's quite a highlight.
That is, isn't it?
And so yes, I'm sure there are others, but I don't want to offend anybody. If you pick one, you missed a few.
Right.
That was quite fun.
Yeah.
Serving my troops in Vietnam was good, and getting them out of there safely, which I worked very hard at. And beating Navy in a couple of weeks, which is not going to be easy. We'll need another telegram.
That's right. Well, maybe we have one at the library. We can send you find another one. Yeah. Well, Ross, I think it's been a very good interview. You certainly provided additional insight about General Eisenhower. I'm pleased that we have some of your records at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, and definitely want to make a copy of this interview available to West Point as well. I'm a firm believer in creating partnerships, because we do have a lot in common.
Absolutely.
And as you know, Eisenhower was a lover of history.
Yes.
So I think he would want us to do that as well. So I want to thank you for the interview, and I also want to thank you for your service to your country.
Thank you, Carl.
Since this is Memorial Day, and
Yes, it
we
is.
shouldn't forget what today is. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mention my interest in it
Okay.
anyway.
Let's talk about the Jefferson Library
Well,
at West Point.
when I was, I think I wrote my first letter in 1972, when I was at Virginia Law School, which of course is Mr. Jefferson's country. And I did a little research, but it was pretty darn obvious that Thomas Jefferson should be considered a founder of West Point, since he was the President of the United States in 1802. He signed the law that created West Point, but moreover, he lobbied for it after once telling George Washington in a cabinet meeting that he thought a military institution might be unconstitutional, but he changed his mind on that, and within 5 or 6 years was actively promoting the creation of the military academy. And I had suggested that the old library be renamed Jefferson Library. What more perfect a founder who also was so well known for his library, created the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, etc., etc. And it was never given any attribution at West Point. There's one street named for Jefferson, but the West Point's always been considered part of Thayer. Sylvanus Thayer is the father. George Washington is the founder, which is not really true because he was deceased by the time the academy was founded. There are others, Knox and Adams, people who supported the military, but it was Thomas Jefferson who signed the law, and in fact something we just discovered as part of our research is that he personally appointed Sylvanus Thayer as a cadet, and he went on to become the most active and successful superintendent of the academy, which resulted in him being treated, and properly so, as the father of the military academy. We did a symposium that I helped sponsor, the history department, where we are now, did a symposium on Jefferson, which led to a book of Mr. Jefferson's Military Academy, the founding of West Point, where we got the best Jeffersonian scholars, including Rob McDonald, who's a PhD here in the history department, who edited it. And the symposium went on for a week or so as part of our bicentennial of the Military Academy. And it laid what my classmate Bob Doty said is he was the head of the history department, was the intellectual foundation for naming the new library for Thomas Jefferson, which has been approved, and it's 80% finished across the street from where we sit. And we're adding certain things to it to what I say Jeffersonize it somewhat, in that we'll have some artifacts from Monticello up here. We hope to secure a loan of the Declaration of Independence from the New York Public Library. It's well in the works. It's not done yet. It's a very rare copy in Thomas Jefferson's own hand. It is a copy that has his original draft, including pieces in it, such as a paragraph on slavery, that was excised by the Continental Congress. It's called a fair draft, which he called it himself, meaning that's what I wrote, that's what I wanted, and then these guys changed it. And there are only 2 copies extant, and the one in the New York Public Library has moved once in over 100 years. But it's such a perfect New York to New York, library to library, Jefferson Library. We think we'll get the approvals we need from the trustees, and with publicity, it should be a very capstone of the opening of the new library, which is scheduled for early fall of next year, maybe August, September of next year. So it's something I've spent some time on, and I'm quite excited about.
Great.
Okay?
Thank you.